We've Been Around the Block is a podcast normally coming to you from the heart of KZN Midlands, but today from an undisclosed location near Pretoria. I am Anthony Jarvie, your host of the podcast, and my special guest today is Dr. Rikus, who heads up the plant protection research for the Corteva Group for Africa and Middle East. Very welcome, Rikus.
Thank you, Anthony. It's nice to be here.
Rikus, we've worked together for many decades, actually. But for the listener, tell us a little bit about your career path.
Indeed, Anthony, I think we both have careers that now span into the 20-so years. So, starting in 1998 in Greytown, working for Panacea as the plant pathologist. At that time, coming from the University of the Free State, where I lectured, and also did my PhD in rust diseases, but mostly on the cereal diseases. And then joining Panacea. So it's been a career around 30 years in agriculture.
And now you've changed direction slightly?
Yeah, so the first 20 years of my career, can I say, in the Corteva Group, or starting with Panacea at the time, started as the plant pathologist and technical services manager. And that was really just focusing on the crop side. So all the diseases on maize, on soybeans, on sunflower, sorghum, all of them, really giving that support to the breeders who develops new cultivars and new hybrids, screening them for disease resistance and that type of thing. So really the focus was all about the crop. And then 20 years later...
Before you get there, you also took another slight change in direction halfway through, where you headed up the biotechnology side in an industry which is now very much mainstream now.
Yeah, that was part of my, I think, just the progress in my career, also starting as the pathologist, and the technical manager part really then came in where I looked after the biotechnology group. So there was a very small group at that stage and a laboratory in Greytown that did marker-assisted breeding and some purity work on the hybrids and the seed productions, and also the analytical lab that did some quality testing on the oil content of sunflower and those type of things. So technical services, really pathology, analytical, and the biotechnology.
Right, and then the last leg of your career so far has taken a turn into the chemistry side.
I think in the last few years, in even working in the seed business at the time, more focus on the seed platform, I did a lot of work on developing some spray programs for disease management and managing the risk in maize diseases and soybean diseases and all of the crops that we actually worked with. And I think there was always a spark of interest there, working with either the foliar applications and even seed treatments, which is also, of course, big in the crop protection business. And then got approached a year or so ago and then asked to head up the research part of crop protection for Corteva and responsible for the team in the whole Africa and Middle East.
Yeah, so it really has been a natural progression to where you got now.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things. It's a steep learning curve again. The work moving away from the seed side, where the germplasm and the hybrids and the cultivars, and then suddenly changing into crop protection, where it's all about active ingredients and formulations and registrations, and which is a very difficult new game to learn again. The regulatory side of it is very different.
Right. So the podcast name is We've Been Around the Block, and you certainly qualify on being around the block. Considering where you are at the moment, and you know what, I always thought of myself being fitter than you, but obviously you are a lot faster because you've been around the block a lot more. And the way I see it is you still got a long trajectory ahead of you. In your career, you have rubbed shoulders with the plant breeding greats of yesteryear. You have shepherded your team through the deep waters of biotechnology. And now you currently lead your group in chemical plant protection. This is really the perfect 360-degree attack on plant pathogens. And you are the perfect person to have on this podcast as a guest. 2 episodes ago, we discussed soybean rust in quite a lot of detail. And today the objective is to look at controlling soybean rust. So we stopped short of discussing rust control in the last episode. And our job today is to have a look at fungicidal control of soybean rust. And in particular, we would like to have a look at when, how, and what to control. After a short commercial break, we will discuss soybean rust. Today's episode is sponsored by Panacea. Well, what can I say about Panacea today? Panacea call themselves the multi-crop specialists, so let's see whether this holds up to scrutiny. Most seed houses sell maize or hybrid maize seed, and some of them sell other crops as well. But as the number of crops increases, the list of seed houses that sell them diminishes rapidly. For many of these seed houses, this is just padding. In Panacea's case, along with hybrid maize, they sell soybeans, dry beans obviously, but also sunflower, wheat, sorghum, and forages. And this is definitely not padding. Panacea has invested in research and technical support for these crops, and if they're not in the top yield position in a crop, they certainly are competing for that top spot. As our agriculture becomes more and more specialized, rotation becomes increasingly more important, and Panacea is that perfect one-stop shop for you. Right, so we're back with soybean rust and control of it using fungicides. Let's start with when. So when is the best time to control soybean rust?
Anthony, I almost want to step back a little bit in where this all started, because it does tell a little bit about the story of when. Is when we first discovered soybean rust in KZN, and I remember very well that Friday afternoon in 2001 when one of our sales guys walked into the lab and said, "What is this on the soybean?" And it was rust. We knew it was on our borders, but I mean the excitement, we as pathologists, we always get excited about diseases where farmers don't. But anyway, that was a kind of a breakthrough moment, and then starting to scout. And I remember in the Karkloof area where we then went and saw some farmers, and they said they know the disease is here. Should we spray or not? And when do we spray? And standing there talking to a farmer, and he said, "Do I have to spray?" And I've been through his fields, and I could not spot any symptoms of soybean rust. Now, this was a new disease. Nobody really knew what to look for exactly, and we're very unfamiliar with it. And I could not see any rust, and I said, "No, I don't think you should spray." But while standing there, just looking across the valley to the neighbor's farm, and saw something in his soybean fields that just looked very strange, and asking Tony, "What's happening there in your neighbor's fields?" And he said, "I don't know, but let's phone him." And he phoned, and he said, "No, he doesn't know, but this is very strange." And we drove over there, and it was just soybean rust everywhere in the field. And we stood there and we tried to figure out what's going on here, because it was exactly the same variety. Nobody sprayed, and the one is just full of soybean rust and the other one not. And eventually it really came out, the one farmer planted 2 weeks before the other guy. So it immediately showed us that the disease was very specific in terms of when it attacked the plant. There's a certain stage in the physiology of the soybean plant where it really came in. And that kind of opened the whole issue of the fact that you have to be preventative with your control.
Yeah, the currently registered controls are all preventative.
I think that is the most critical part of soybean rust control. You have to be preventative. As soon as you see any rust pustules on the leaf, that leaf will drop. So you really have to be there before the disease arrives.
Right. And so what we normally see is soybean rust coming in after flowering?
Yeah, that's correct, because I think at the time what we also saw, there were different varieties planted in the demo site. And I remember Octa, for instance, that was there, which was a later variety. And we could clearly see the early varieties as soon as after flowering, that early pod stage, that's when the rust really came into the crop.
Right. And what it looked like with the longer season varieties, it looked like they had resistance, but, it was just a matter of time and they would get it.
Absolutely. So they almost served as a good warning system as well, the early varieties, that something is there and you need to take precaution on.
Right. So farmers would generally then spray after flowering. And we probably got 3 categories of of areas. So the first category is areas that never get rust. And so obviously those guys wouldn't spray. You get areas that always get rust, and farmers would have to have some sort of strategy to spray on a regular basis every year. And then the problem area is actually those areas that get rust infrequently. And so their strategy might differ from the areas that get rust every year.
Yeah, definitely. I think we know that the mist belt areas, KwaZulu-Natal, the Kaapkloof, around Pietermaritzburg, Great Town area, those are really hot spots in terms of the soybean rust. And then in some years you will see it moving up into the Free State, but even there when it comes in, it's so late, it really does have no effect. So it is always difficult to decide, where the cutoff is. In the hot spots, there's no way around it. Every year you are going to spray for soybean rust. Yeah, but as you say, in some of the other areas, it might be a difficult decision. The sentinel plots that are still being grown out there, that serves as a warning that the rust is in the area, I think does serve a very specific purpose. It does tell you that there might be rust and you have to start looking at a preventative spray.
Right. So if we then move on to the what. So what is available for farmers to use to spray against soybean rust?
Also again, when we took that first few steps, it was really a hit and miss situation, trying to figure out what did we have that we could spray for maize diseases, looking at products that was there that was good on rust, maybe of the cereals, and just playing around with those. And the chemical companies really came to the party and did some excellent work and did emergency registrations. As it stands now, there's 33 registered products in South Africa, very specifically for soybean rust.
Right. So just as a side, are the rust pathogens similar between, say, maize rust and soybean rust in terms of the fungicide activity, or are they quite different?
I think the one thing that we did see with soybean rust is once the rust is there and you spray with a strobilurine type of fungicides, we never seen that immediate effect where it stopped sporulation. Okay. While in maize rust, for instance, if I come in and I see the rust and I spray 3-4 days later, I can actually see that the sporulation has stopped.
Okay, so I think that's an important thing. Farmers that may understand maize rust need to know that soybean rust is different.
Yes, you absolutely have to be there before sporulation.
Right. And so of these 33 products that are currently available for use on soybeans, many of them are combination products, right?
A lot of them combinations. There's still a few in the list that I saw that are single products, mostly triazole type products. There are 1 or 2 strobilurine type of products. And I think the danger with all of those are always resistance issues, that we know that you target a specific, a single target site, and the possibility of resistance is always big. But the bulk of the products that we see out there are very good combinations of different type of actives.
Right, so many of the products are then 2 or more actives in a single spray, which then assists in combating the buildup of resistance to that particular product. But very often we would be spraying more than one spray during the season, and so what is the strategy in terms of which fungicides to use when?
For all of us, I really think if we can follow the good FRAC principles, and really FRAC means the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, or the group that looks after managing resistance in all fungicides. There are some very clear guidelines on the type of products that you use, the timing of the products, and also the number of times that you should be using the same product in a sequence. So a lot of the times you will clearly see on a label that it will tell you do not apply more than 2 times in the same season, and then you have to follow up with something else. And I think also just talking about that, and one must also remember that when you start following up crops and you use the same products, it also becomes part of that sequence, so that we all also have to manage that.
Right. So very often farmers would have a fungicide store, and he would draw out fungicides for both maize and soybeans. And so this is obviously the products that he uses on maize will have some implication on what he does with these soybeans.
Yes, absolutely, because some of these products obviously share registrations for the different crops.
Okay. And is there a decent guideline? So I just know that if you use a strobe-based fungicide, that you would probably use that as your first application and not your last application?
I would really think that would be my preference. And there's also a number of reasons why I'm saying that, because I still believe that the strobilurin type fungicides are the best preventative type of products that you get on the market currently. Some of the triazoles are maybe more corrective type of product. And that also sometimes make these combinations very effective because they kind of play a dual role. But as I said, so from a timing aspect, I really think it's because maybe better preventative. And then later on really maybe going to a triazole product or one of those types, because what we have also noticed that the strobilurins really brings a greening effect to the plant. And I think one should be careful that you often end up where the plants actually stay green, and it really creates problems when you start combining, that you have the soybeans and then you have to go to alternative methods to dry down the soybeans, which is not always the best practice.
Yeah. Also, the strobies tend to have a longer working life, and perhaps then also a longer withholding period, which means that you would rather not spray that too close to harvest, or fear of having residual in your grain.
Yes, and I think as without being specific to specific projects, I think it's just following the good guidelines as they appear on the label. And normally the label is really comprehensive in that way that it will tell you the withholding time, and do not apply later than this stage, or do one of these and not the second one. So I think the information is out there, and it's really just the best stewardship principles to follow the label guidelines.
And I think it's becoming more and more important to us. Previously we were a fairly small soybean grain producer, and almost all the soybean grain was used locally. But now, more frequently, we are seeing that some grain gets exported. And if it gets exported to Europe, their regulations are way more stricter than ours. And so it does make a big difference in terms of the withholding period. I think we need to make very sure that we are within the stewardship guidelines.
Yeah, absolutely. And because, when you do bring a new fungicide to the market, you don't only test the efficacy of the product, whether it controls the disease. Part of the registration process is the residue studies. What are the residues at a specific stage? As you say, then when you go into an export, does it exceed it, or is it less than the residues that's allowed on that crop?
Right. And then also, just in line with the stewardship thing, is the safety for the people applying it and the farmers and the workers, right?
Yes, it is. Normally the fungicides, I've found out probably the more friendlier, if I can call it so, safer products. So often the green or the blue label type of fungicide, so not that dangerous to people, but still the principles need to be applied, that these are still pesticides and you have to take care.
All right, good. Right, so that brings us on to how. How do we go about applying these fungicides most effectively?
The how, I almost also want to start with, use the registered products. That should be the first rule, and don't just go off-label and try anything that you read about on Dr. Google or something like that. Really try and focus on the registered products, because those have very specific rates. And if we do not do that, and again coming back to the stewardship discussion, you might easily lose a product because of resistance buildup. And so that to me still is critical.
Right. So I just remember right in the beginning of the soybean rust era, we had some discrepancies between the rates used in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. And part of the problem was that they were using reduced rates in Zimbabwe for a cost perspective. And actually from a stewardship side, that was really quite bad.
There's a very fine balance between the efficacy that you can achieve with a certain rate and what is acceptable. Do you want a 100% clean plant, or do you tolerate some of the disease, and versus that kind of costing. But the risk is always there with a lower rate, that you will get a resistance buildup. And remember, a soybean rust is what they call a polycyclic pathogen. In other words, it keeps generating new spores throughout the season. So there's a lot of cycles. And in that combination, the chances of resistance buildup and mutation is much higher than in other diseases.
Right. Yeah. It's certainly been, as a pathogen for soybeans, it's certainly been one of the more serious challenges that breeders have had, because the pathogen has multi-virulence factors within it. Yeah.
It mutates extremely quickly, and I think we spoke about it briefly earlier. If you look at resistance as an issue, the problem is not just the efficacy that you lose. There's a lot of investment going into bringing a new product to the market. We're talking about years, 8, 9, 10 years maybe to bring it. And I think we looked at it recently, and it was around $300 million US dollars to bring a new product to the market. So it's a huge investment. You don't want to lose it.
Yeah. So it's actually everybody's responsibility to make sure that we keep the products which are registered, keep them active.
Yep, absolutely.
Right. So just getting back to how we go about spraying, what is the best strategy in applying the fungicides?
I think the nice thing about the soybeans, you don't need a really high type of equipment like when you're spraying maize plants. Maize is easy. Your first spray you can do with a tractor, but you get into after tassel and those things, you have very tall plants. Soybeans, you do not have that problem. So I think most of the farmers really already have the equipment on the farm. If they can plant a soybean, they can probably spray a soybean, because you really need a good tractor type of ground application, or any of these new spray rigs. Very, very, very good in controlling soybean.
Right. So for most soybean farmers are not primarily soybean farmers. They're actually probably maize farmers who rotate with soybeans. And so that equipment would be available to them. So they don't perhaps need a high boy, but they do need nice high volumes, right?
Yes, I think in fungicides, and especially if you look at something like soybean rust, and remember, sometimes we talk about controlling soybean rust, but you're also controlling the other diseases. So you really need a penetration into the canopy. We can see soybean rust starting on the bottom leaves. So really looking at volumes, 200, 250, 300 liters per hectare.
Right. And also to get the spray to penetrate into the canopy, because we're doing this now after R1, so it's in the reproductive stage. And by that stage, the crop is canopied quite nicely. And so you need good pressure and good penetration all the way down. With most these products, they are locally systemic, right? But you have to actually target the bottom leaves too.
Yes. A lot of them have systemic activity, but yeah, still always good to penetrate the crop and at least go down 2/3 of the crop.
Right. So in that case, aerial application works as well, right? Tractor application is good. If you have some sort of windsock, that would help quite considerably. And the idea is to get a nice, a fine mist.
Yes, no, distribution of the product, is critical. And you asked the question about aerial application. Definitely, we saw how efficient it could be, especially if you're talking huge hectares and you need to get in there quickly and control the disease. Aerial application is very good. But again, critical. We saw some sites where the aeroplane just slightly went up higher than it should be, and you could clearly see the cutoff line where you didn't penetrate the crop. I think you're looking at nozzles also. Maybe it's just also maybe critical to definitely a good principle is still to inspect your nozzles, and whatever you spray, whether it's a fungicide you're going into that season, just always check the nozzles, because nozzles do take a hammering, they wear and tear, and the distribution is not what it should be. And nozzles for herbicides and fungicides and insecticides is not necessarily the same. So I think it's critical to also just make sure that you have the right nozzle for the right product.
So that really winds up the how we get about applying fungicides. Are there new products in the pipeline coming through?
Definitely the pipeline, and obviously, my reference is the Corteva pipeline that I can see, and I'm very excited about the pipeline coming through. There is some really interesting new products coming through the pipeline. Can't say too much about them at this stage, but they're in different phases of being tested. So it's really about now bringing it to market, doing local testing, efficacy testing, going through a registration process, which is quite a long time at certain stages, but very, very interesting products that are coming through.
Well, the reassuring thing is that we already have 30-odd products in registration, and so it's not like we're sitting there with a great big hole. But obviously new products are exciting stuff for soybean producers.
And it's not just the fact that you're just bringing something that gives you the same type of control as the previous products. You're always trying to achieve a better control, but also striving towards maybe a greener product, a friendlier, safer product. I think that is, so there's a lot of things about bringing new products. And we must also remember that the two things work in parallel, the crop and the crop protection. They work very closely together. If you look at even the new traits coming through on soybeans, if we're talking about South Africa, the value of the crop is also increasing. So it's really trying to now again protecting that yield potential on that high value crop that is coming to market.
Right. So this is really where we get the whole thing coming together, where we have the plant breeding efforts, the crop protection chemistry efforts, and also just the cultural practices coming together. And actually, one of the new things is also the digital ag. So we're having new developments in digital technology which should and could assist in scouting and picking up new diseases and also monitoring the progress of diseases.
Yes, everything just gets together at some stage where you're talking traits, crop protection, conventional breeding, digital. It's I think it's just amazing. I mean, seeing the progress over the 20 odd years that we've been working in the crop, is just seeing all these things coming in from the side and all adding to this. So digital is definitely a big one. And I mean, we're just talking about traits. I mean, the next thing we are seeing is traits coming through that gives soybean rust resistance.
Rikus, it's been wonderful chatting to you about soybean rust control, and I certainly hope that we can have you back on the podcast sometime. We really need to circle around and touch on sclerotinia at some stage. And for your sins, we'll call on you to help us with the chemical control of sclerotinia. We'll wind up the podcast for today, and until next time, take care.